Are we suggesting that we go ahead and not wait for Linda?
I think, Mayor, we can do that. And then just to determine whether there are even any public comments. If they are, the council may wish to wait. But if there are no public comments, then we can go right into closed session.
Let's go ahead then. Hello and good evening. I'm going to call us to order and ask for a roll call of the City Council, please.
Councilmember Mock.
Present.
Councilmember Schmidt.
Yes, here.
Councilmember Tonka.
Yeah.
Vice Mayor Swan. Mayor Tyson.
Thank you. I will now seek, we're on item number 2, public comment, and public comment limited to items which are the subject of the special meeting. And so members may comment now. I don't see any public comment. So I will say we will move on to item number 3, adjourn to closed session. And just for everyone here on this link, we will return to this link when we're done with the closed session for the open session that will start at 6 o'clock. With that, I will say let's adjourn this closed session.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to our special City Council and Planning Commission meeting on January 19th. We already called to order at 5 o'clock, went into closed session, and we've adjourned closed session, and I'm here to report that we have no actions taken in closed session. With that, I'm ready to move on to item number 6 in the agenda, which is called order for this City Council and Planning Commission. And let's start off, please, with the roll call.
Commissioner Kuperis. He is acknowledged he's here. Commissioner Patel.
Yes.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Vice Chair Washura.
Here.
Chair Indigo.
Here.
Councilmember Mock.
Present.
Councilmember Swan.
Here.
No, you're Vice Mayor Swan. Sorry about that. Councilmember Schmidt.
Yes, here.
Councilmember Tonka.
Yeah.
Mayor Tyson.
Here. Thank you very much. Let's get started with the Pledge of Allegiance. Please join me. It's okay to mute, and we'll begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. And we'll move on to item number 7, which is public comment. Any public comment limited to items which are the subject of the special meeting? Do we have any? I see one public comment. And if you could please elevate Steve Jordan.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, Steve.
Okay, sorry, I'm not used to being in webinar mode. Steve Jordan, resident on Viscano Court and elected director of Prism Hills Water District. Just want to say the Water District is very interested in the housing plan. And the reason being is that we don't have enough water to handle a substantial increase in number of houses. So, and particularly, of course, SB 9 houses, because we suspect they will use significant amounts of water, but we also suspect ADUs will use additional water as residents try to screen the ADU from the main house. So I think our interest is in seeing somewhere at the end of this process, some kind of forecast that allows us to figure out how many houses there will be and therefore how much the water demand will be. And we expect that there's over the next 1 to 2 years, we will need to spend a significant amount of money to acquire additional water rights that may require a vote of our constituents. And so, bottom line is that'll require a pretty well understood forecast. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. I see we have another member of the public, Sasha Zbrozek.
Your pronunciation of my last name was excellent. Thank you.
Oh my goodness.
All right, so California law tells us that we must examine and remove constraints to building, and we have many of those. It tells us that we must examine potential sites for net new development and to be realistic about their likelihood of development. I hope that we do those things, and I hope that we do them diligently and honestly. I was disappointed to find that we lied on our previous progress report, claiming rebuilds as new housing. Los Altos did exactly the same thing and got a stern reprimand from the Department of Housing and Community Development. I think we can do better. We can and we should do the right thing. Thank you.
Thank you for those comments, Sasha. I do not see any other public comment, and so I will bring it back and move on to item number 7, which is the study session itself. And with that, I would like to hand it to staff for a staff report.
Thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Mayor, members of the City Council, Planning Commission, and members of the public. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us tonight for this virtual joint special meeting. As some of you may be aware or will become aware after tonight's meeting, that the town has begun updating its housing element for the period 2023 through 2031, which is due to Department of Housing and Community Development, in short, HCD, by January 2023. Tonight's meeting is designed to provide informational presentation on housing element update and its process. It's more like a 30,000 foot view of the process and its requirements. We do encourage our community members to visit our housing element update webpage for additional information, to learn about upcoming meetings, and to stay involved in the process. We have a dedicated email address for you to email us your comments, concerns, ideas, and feedback. We will share the email towards the end of the presentation. With that, I will introduce the project team. From the town staff, we have Steve Padawan and myself, Sophia Mangalam, Planning and Building Director. And then we have our consultant team, Michael Baker International. We have Dan Berry, Aaron Barrell, and Veronica Tam. With that, I'll hand it over to Aaron, who will provide you with the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. First off, before we get started, can everybody see my screen and hear me okay? Okay, it looks good.
Yes.
All right, well, thanks so much for that introduction. My name is Aaron Barral, and I'm with Michael Baker International. I will be helping on this housing element update. Here's the project team that Sophia just went over. My role is going to be one of the task leads and leader of certain elements of the housing element itself. So really quick, before we get started, I want to talk about why we're meeting and our overall goals for today. And really what we want to do is review the requirements for the 2023 to 2031 housing element, including the process, including recent housing legislation. And then we'll close with a schedule and a question and answer session to discuss any questions that the council or the commission may have. This presentation is about 20 slides long, and it's probably going to run for about 25 minutes, give or take, just so you know what to expect. So we begin with, what is a housing element? So a housing element is a required element of the town's general plan, and it needs to be updated every 8 years. The next update is due to the state of California on January 31st, 2023. And it's a plan that's going to help the town meet demand for housing at all income levels. And it's important to note that this isn't just for the town, this is also to help address some of the regional housing needs. So including some of the needs from the subregion in Silicon Valley and Santa Clara County, as well as the broader Bay Area region. Some of the key components of the element and things that we'll be doing are assessing the housing needs, housing constraints, and housing resources. The element is going to set goals, objectives, and policies. And very importantly, it's going to commit to specific programs that will act as an action plan for what the city will be doing to improve housing accessibility and affordability over the next 8 years. One of the most important components is the zoning and identification of sites, which will help meet the need for all incomes. As many of you have probably heard, the city has been assigned 489 units by ABAG, and we'll talk a little bit about that more later. This is the number of the regional share that the city must meet in order to help meet the housing shortage. Additionally, the town must include some specific programs to help promote fair housing. For Los Altos Hills, this really means facilitating the development and construction of affordable housing. In this slide, I'll talk a little bit about the overview and the process and some of the state requirements. So as I mentioned earlier, there's a state mandated update schedule. This is every 8 years. And the next cycle is from 2023 to 2031. We are currently in the 2015 to 2023 cycle, which many people call it, it's known as the 5th cycle housing element, and the upcoming housing element is the 6th cycle. So if I ever mention those terms, that's what they mean. Again, the adoption deadline is January 31st, 2023, but the state does provide for a 120-day grace period, which allows the housing element to be adopted at no time later than May 31st, 2023. So there is a little bit of leeway, but in order to remain in compliance with state law, the town absolutely must adopt the housing element by May 31st, 2023. The process involves HCD review at multiple points. So the California Housing and Community Development Department, or HCD for short, is in charge of overseeing all of these housing elements across the entire state. And they review the town's housing element for compliance with state law and make the determination on whether it's adequate and meets the requirements of state law or whether it doesn't. And if it doesn't, they will issue a letter and some findings and request some revisions before they will accept it. And I know I've said it earlier and we'll talk about it a lot tonight. One of the main goals for this housing element is to plan for accommodating the jurisdiction's regional housing needs allocation, or the RHNA for short. So I'll probably be referring to it as the RHNA, but it's the number that the ABAG and the state have given the town to plan for over this 8-year cycle. There are a lot of different pieces that go into a housing element, and we always start with a review of the accomplishments. This includes an evaluation of the previous housing element, including housing production, including implementation of programs, and any assistance that may have benefited individuals with unique housing needs, such as those who might be disabled or elderly. We'll also conduct a needs assessment, and this is a very comprehensive demographic analysis using census and HUD data, or Housing and Urban Development Department data. This is going to be an analysis of the existing and projected housing needs. And again, it really needs to consider both the needs within the town right now, as well as the needs within the broader region. Housing resources includes an inventory of land, as well as other aspects like funds, grants, or incentives that might help in the production or conservation of housing. The main component of this, again, is the RHNA. It's the 489 units that the town has been assigned. A heavy emphasis on this section is going to be on how the town will provide zoning for multifamily units, particularly those that will be affordable to lower and moderate income households. We will also conduct a constraint analysis. So a constraint broadly is anything that deters or increases costs of housing production. And you can think of it as falling into 2 buckets. So on one hand, you have the governmental constraints. These are things like zoning or permit processing procedures or fees. That's a governmental constraint. And then there are also non-governmental constraints like flood or fire zones, and even things like the price of construction materials and labor. Those would be considered non-governmental constraints. Additionally, we need to look at fair housing, including an assessment of fair housing conditions, a commitment to meaningful actions that improve fair housing in the city. Finally, there will be an implementation plan, which has the goals, policies, and programs to meet the unmet needs, remove constraints, provide the zone capacity, and improve the fair housing conditions. Essentially, this implementation plan will be addressing all of the findings that were listed in the above sections of the housing element. There have been a lot of changes to state law in recent years. In fact, only 30 bills just this last September, and we are expecting more in the current legislative session. So I'm going to highlight only 4 bills that have really significantly changed the requirements for housing elements. The first one is Assembly Bill 1398, which was passed last year. And what this does is it changes the timeline for required rezoning for the housing element. If HCD has not approved the housing element by the end of the 120-day grace period, then the town only has 1 year to rezone for its RENA units instead of 3. So if the town gets found in compliance prior to May 31st, 2023, it will have 3 years to rezone. But if the town is not found to be in compliance by that deadline, then it will actually only have 1 year to rezone for those units. Assembly Bill 215, also passed last year, really increased the amount of public review and HCD review in terms of time that the housing element needs to build into its schedule. Before, it used to be about 75 days between making a public review draft available and getting HCD comments. Now it's about 4.5 months. And so it's really cut down the amount of time to develop a housing element. And so that reflects pretty drastically throughout the schedule. Combining these 2 bills, there's a little bit less time to actually write the housing element, and there are more consequences if it is failed to be certified in a timely way. Assembly Bill 1397 was passed a couple years ago, and this is a very significant bill that addresses the RENA and the sites requirements. It sets much more stringent requirements for RENA sites and emphasizes the short-term development likelihood. So as this bill essentially requires that the town needs to demonstrate that the sites it chooses for its housing are likely to develop and they're feasible to develop within the next 8 years, instead of having any type of maybe hypothetical capacity. It needs to be very real capacity. Senate Bill 166, this is colloquially known as the no net loss law. Cities must maintain adequate capacity for all income levels throughout the housing element cycle, throughout the 8-year period. And I think the best way to illustrate this is through an example. So if the town had a site that, say, potentially had 10 units assigned in the housing element, and somebody comes and builds on that site, and there are only 5 units that actually get built, then the city needs to make sure that it has the extra 5, the difference between the projected and the real units, accounted for. And it has 6 months to identify new sites, including any potential rezones that might be required to meet that need. The RENA, the Regional Housing Needs Allocation. So the RENA really originates with the state, the Housing and Community Development Department, in coordination with the Department of Finance, determine the statewide housing need, and then they allocate that by the different regions of the state. So obviously Los Altos Hills is in the Bay Area, so you're in the ABAG region, but they also do this for the Southern California region, or SCAG, as well as Sacramento. Once it goes to ABAG, ABAG then allocates that to each city and also the unincorporated jurisdictions, gives them a number. And so you can see that ABAG has 176,000 units assigned, and the town has 489 units assigned. Just for context, here's a comparison with the previous RENA, and you can see the 5th cycle on the left in brown and the 6th cycle, or the upcoming housing element cycle, on the right. The Bay Area experienced about a 135% increase. Santa Clara County had a 144% increase, and the town of Los Altos Hills had a 304% increase. So as I mentioned earlier, SB 166 requires that the town always maintain enough sites to meet the RENA during the planning period. This is 489 units total, and 279 of those units are low to moderate income. So any site developed at a lower density or even a different income than was projected must replace or rezone that lost capacity within 6 months of the loss occurring, which is generally thought to be when the project is approved. For this reason, the town actually needs to include zoning for units above its RENA, which are buffer sites. These are not technically mandated by law, but they're strongly encouraged by HCD. And I have not seen a housing element that doesn't propose a buffer site yet, or buffer capacity. The rule of thumb is generally to zone at least 20% above the baseline RENA, or 20% more than the 489 units. And what that does is it prevents the city from needing to continuously rezone to replace lost units throughout the housing element cycle. Here we can see the 5th cycle RENA and the 6th cycle RENA broken down by the income. And we also have a buffer on the 3rd row there. So the main thing to take away from this is that the town experienced an increase in all of its income levels, but it really experienced the most significant increase in the above moderate income. So the 5th cycle had 15, and now the 6th cycle will have 210. And with the 20% buffer applied, we expect that the town really needs to zone for at least 587 new units in order to be safe under state law, and at least add some time and some buffer as necessary. Here's what those income levels mean. So HCD every year publishes median incomes by county for the entire state, and the median income in Santa Clara County is $151,300. And so what that means is a very low income family of 4 has an income, the top income that they could make would be a little bit less than $83,000 a year. Low income, this is between 50 and 80% of the county's median income, is about $118,000 a year. And then above moderate is anything above 120% of the median income, which is almost $182,000 per year. The moderate income is actually anything between that low and that above moderate. So a moderate income household would be anywhere from 118 to 181,000 per year. To achieve affordable housing production, state law does set some density requirements for low income and very low income housing. The current minimum density set in state law for Los Altos Hills is 20 units an acre. And this means that any site that is projected to meet the income for low or very low households, or meet the need for low or very low income households, will have a density of about 20 units an acre. There is a chance actually that this will get updated to 30 units an acre. This is wholly contingent upon how HCD interprets the results of the 2020 census and whether they update their numbers there. There is no minimum density set in state law for moderate income households, but generally these moderate income sites need to at least allow for multifamily housing. And in our experience, a density should be no less than 12 units per acre. 12 units per acre is pretty typical of a townhome style development. And there are no minimum densities for the above moderate income households. However, again, depending on how HCD interprets the recent census, there might be some requirements for some multifamily housing, even within the above moderate income category. There's a lot that goes into the sites inventory, and there are a lot of very strict requirements set by AB 1397 and other subsequent laws that inform what we can use and how we project the number of units for each site. Most importantly, we really need to use a realistic capacity that accounts for constraints and accounts for the likelihood of development. What this means is we can't just count the maximum number of units that would be allowed on a site under the zoning. We need to take everything into account and come up with a realistic capacity for each site. Additionally, lower income sites need to be between half an acre and 10 acres. We're not really anticipating this to be a problem in the town based off the lot sizes right now, but it is a requirement for all of the lower income sites. The sites need to be served by infrastructure, including water, wastewater, and dry utilities such as electricity or telecommunications. There is a little bit of leeway with some of the above moderate sites, and they may rely on septic instead of having a dedicated wastewater line. The land that we put in the sites inventory needs to be developable. Again, it needs to account for environmental constraints. So we know that the city has constraints like steep slopes, flood zones, fire zones, and fault lines. And we need to bake those into the assumptions for the site's inventory as we move forward and make sure that any site is actually developable in the near term. Near-term development opportunity could mean a couple things. Often it means that there's owner or developer interest in pursuing a project on a site, or that the land is vacant or underutilized. Finally, the site's inventory is required by law to further fair housing. And for the city, this means avoiding concentrating all new housing, particularly low and moderate, in a single location. And it also means locating that lower income housing sites as much as possible close to resources such as employment or educational facilities. Here's some other constraints that inform the site capacity and selection. When it comes to land use and zoning, it's really about the density. So the density will help inform the site capacity. It's probably the most important factor. But we know that the town doesn't have that much vacant land. And so that's a significant constraint that we need to account for when building the site's inventory. And these are just examples, but zoning requirements such as parking or setbacks also need to be considered and can reduce the yield or likelihood of a site being developed. Again, we need to account for environmental constraints such as steep slopes, floodplains, fire hazard, or sensitive habitat areas. One of the key components along with the site's inventory or the RENA is the housing programs and the housing actions that the town is going to be taking. One of the major programs, again, will be to provide for adequate sites and zoning for the housing need throughout the planning period. Another one that's required by the state is to promote accessory dwelling unit production. Other programs might take the form of education initiatives for residents or developers, or maybe even other stakeholders in the larger community. The city needs to implement a suite of programs to remove constraints, as well as address the requirements of new state laws. And it needs to address the requirements to affirmatively further fair housing. Affirmatively furthering fair housing was added by Assembly Bill 686 in 2018. And it means taking meaningful action in addition to combating discrimination that overcome patterns of segregation and foster inclusive communities. This means that the town needs to look at its fair housing outreach and enforcement capacity. How does the town comply with existing civil rights law? And are there any issues that have been reported? We need to look at segregation and integration patterns, both within the town as well as the larger region. Identify any racially or ethnically concentrated areas of poverty or racially and ethnically concentrated areas of affluence. Identify disparities in access to opportunity, and access to opportunity could be something like education or healthcare, or even environmental resources like clean air. Disproportionate housing needs and risk of displacement. And so if there are any residents in the town that maybe have special housing needs or they're at risk of displacement for one reason or another, this part needs to look at them as well. But again, I keep coming back to it, but there needs to be meaningful goals, policies, and actions. And these meaningful goals, policies, and actions must include specific metrics, timelines, and evaluation criteria to help the city track its progress over the cycle. There are some pretty significant consequences for not complying with housing element law, including a disqualification from state funding and disqualification from certain grants. Additionally, the town, if it doesn't rezone or meet its housing needs, would actually have to carry over the unit allocation to the next cycle. So the 489 units, if those weren't accommodated here, then it would get added on to your total in another 8 years. There are pretty significant fines and penalties that the state has the authority to levy on the town, up to $600,000 a month at the very worst case, if the town isn't making actions or making progress in complying with housing element law. In rare cases, and this is uncommon to my knowledge, but the state does have the ability to appoint a special agent to actually write a housing element for the town. And that would really remove all of the local control that the town has, and it would take the town out of the process, and essentially the housing element would be written by the state of California. A short-term and very consequential impact is the inability to deny new projects. So state law currently says that if the housing element is not in compliance and a developer comes in with a project that has lower income units, at least 20% lower income units, then that developer actually does not need to follow the town's general plan or its zoning ordinance. So that's a very, very significant consequence of noncompliance. Also, the state has added a new housing accountability unit, which proactively enforces the state laws. This unit has broad authority to investigate cities and towns that they believe might not be complying with the law and then issue corrective actions. This is a departure from the past where there really wasn't a group within HCD specifically tasked to oversee cities in this state. This is a brand new department, but we know that they've already been taking lots of actions towards certain cities. Community engagement and feedback is crucial to creating a successful housing element. While a lot of the components of the document are driven by state law, the document must also reflect the town's goals and priorities. So there is a website that's been available and you can scan it there, or you can use a search engine to just look for Los Altos Hills housing element update and it will take you to the website. We are planning to have a survey available for everybody beginning on January 31st. And that's really going to be open through the remainder of the project. And so we would encourage everybody in the community, as well as from the council and commission, to fill out that survey. We will also be conducting stakeholder focus groups and interviews in February to identify if there's different groups within the city or that are active within the region that are active in housing policy or have an interest in this. We hope to get their feedback on the town's housing element, identify any potential needs that they have. And there will also be 2 community workshops in March and in May. Here's the schedule. And so we just looked at the community engagement timeline, but as you can see, that's really going to be happening over the next few months. And while that's happening, the housing element will be getting prepared. And that's really something that will continue throughout the entire process. We are anticipating having a public review draft at the very latest by August. CEQA will occur once we have a lot of the community engagement done and we feel like we have a good direction, especially on the sites inventory. And this schedule plans for adoption by the end of January in 2023. So I did mention that we do have a 120-day grace period. So this is an alternate schedule that if there is a situation where the town needs to go back to HCD again to address additional comments, this proposed schedule actually does have enough time in there for it. And that's what it would look like under this alternative scenario. And with that, that is the conclusion of my presentation. I'm happy to answer questions, and I really appreciate Council, Commission, and the public for their time tonight. Thank you so much.
And thank you. We have quite a few people here in the panelists section, so I will ask that you please raise your hand and I will call on you accordingly. First one up is Commissioner Washura. Why don't you go ahead?
Well, I'll be the guinea pig here. I am quite certain that we're all going to forge around a little bit to try and get our footing on such a large undertaking. So I apologize if my initial questions here aren't exactly on point, but I hope they will illuminate some of the questions and provide more light on this subject. We have recently gone through an SB 9 project to adopt what it takes to support SB 9 units in town. And we have our present ADU development strategies underway. How are those planned increases contributing to the 489 number requirement? Is there a certain formula that you use that we can go ahead and cross off a certain number and then realize that we have to kind of whittle down until we get down to zero?
Mayor, if I may.
Yes, please do.
Yeah, so we definitely can count accessory dwelling units and potentially some of the SB 9 units towards meeting the town's share of the RENA. There isn't a specific equation, but the state of California has been pretty wary of jurisdictions trying to meet most or all of their RENA with ADUs. We've also heard from the state that currently they do not have any guidance for SB 9, and we are expecting some guidance in the near future, but there isn't any yet that we can count on reliably. As for how many ADUs the town might be able to count, the state requires an average of the number of building permits that were issued over the past 4 years. So anytime since 2017. So we would take that number and average it. And that's the amount that HCD will let the town count per year.
I see. If you don't mind, Mayor Tyson, I have a couple more. Do you mind?
Please go ahead.
Okay. In the past, my understanding is that on earlier cycles of this type of project, we defined an option to create some higher density housing at Foothill College for staff and families and students. And I had recently heard that because we had used them in the past, we can't use them again in this cycle. Can you describe what impact we might be able to get towards this 489 number by utilizing the Foothill College approach?
Thank you very much for that question. So I think I'll start with the first part, which is just because that there was a program to include high density housing there in the past does not mean that you cannot use them again in the future. So we will be able to use, potentially use, I should say, Foothill College as one of the sites for some of the housing that the city has been assigned. I think that we're not sure exactly yet what that number will be. We need to work with Foothill College as well as really evaluate all of the constraints, the potential for that site, and see what we can maybe count towards it. But there's not a single number, but we would expect to use that site potentially to meet some of the housing need.
And my last question is, with residents listening in, I'm sure they had the same guffaw thought that I did when I heard about multifamily housing, 20 units per acre, that sort of a change for our town. And the word rezoning is new for us. The idea that we would take an area zoned for single family homes and convert it into a 20 unit per acre type of zoning. Can you explain to me, and actually for residents to understand, how would that work if somebody lives along a busy thoroughfare and we decide to make that all 20 unit per acre housing? What happens to the rights that the owners currently have of those properties?
That's a great question. And I think it kind of depends on the ultimate zoning that happens. But essentially, we wouldn't expect that this rezoning would displace any residents or remove any of their existing rights. But what it would do is it would allow them to, if they chose, build a project of that density on their sites or on their house. So oftentimes in other cities and towns, what we'll see is some of this land will get rezoned, and a couple of years later, a developer might come in and put an offer in above market price, and then the developer will actually build the house. And so that is a pretty common result, but it wouldn't force any existing residents to do anything with their land. They would be able to stay in place and they would not be displaced by the rezoning itself.
Well, thank you very, very much. I think it will be a big undertaking to communicate this to everyone so that everyone feels comfortable. Thank you again.
It sure will. Thank you. Thank you, Jim. Let's go to Councilmember Tonka, and then I have some oops, and then me, and then Commissioner Indico.
Thank you. So the way our town, Los Altos Hills, generates RENA units is by allowing ADUs. We have no commercial business in town. We do not have any lots of land, that disposable land. How does a town like ours generate more affordable housing? Because we are dependent on our residents building ADUs. And, you know, we are not a very large town, so we do not have that level of construction in town. So when it comes to our town, or towns our size, what are they doing to facilitate the development of ADUs? Because just encouraging residents to build ADUs is not going to get us to this number right now that we have this year.
Mayor, if I may, that's another great question. And it is challenging. Again, HCD, the state, has been very strict with the amount of ADUs that they will allow towns to count towards meeting their RENA. And we haven't seen a situation at all where the entire RENA was able to be met by ADUs. We think that that is likely something that HCD will not approve. There might be some strategies that the town could use to further encourage ADUs, such as there are a lot of potential options, and I don't want to go too detailed tonight, but some of them could be funding incentives or fee waivers. They could also take the form of slightly relaxed development standards that might be able to encourage ADU production. There's no one strategy, but we do expect that the town will need to rezone for some level of multifamily housing. Even if ADUs construction has been significant over the past few years, and that can take a chunk off the top, we think that it's going to be required.
Thank you. So you think rezoning is the only way we can get there?
So I think we're still at the preliminary stages, and I can't guarantee that nothing will change. There is a possibility that, you know, the town might see a huge uptick in ADU production, or comes up with funding or incentives that are so great that maybe ADUs could meet a greater need. But the state has specifically said, especially as related to the affirmatively furthering fair housing component, that only relying on ADUs is not acceptable. And so they have said that. It's not in the government code specifically, but HCD has made that statement. And so we would expect that some level of multifamily rezoning is going to be required.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go ahead with my questions. They're sort of varying. In fact, I'll just pick up on that last point. I don't believe that our strategy would be relying 100% on ADUs. There will be some development, especially at the above market rate. So it doesn't strike me as that limit on them would be so relevant. Let me back up a little bit. The R in RENA is regional. Is it possible, if you are in a region that has an entity that is exceeding their goals, now granted this is tough to see, for you to be able to trade or actually make sure that the regional goals are met, although a given town or city may not?
The short answer is no, there is not for the town of Los Altos Hills. There are very, very limited situations where unincorporated counties may be able to transfer some of their RENA if there's an annexation. And so that's, again, a very limited and discrete situation that would not apply to you. And that's the only time that that would be allowed.
Okay, because you are actually picking up on my next question, because we are bordered by several unincorporated neighborhoods that I'm not aware of any particular action to annex them. And I don't know whether there would be any incentive for us to further that beyond what's been here before. Can you comment on that?
So this is a somewhat nuanced and complex part of state housing law and the RENA specifically, but what this provision in the government code says is if the city were to annex a part of the county, you would actually need to accommodate that proportion of the units that the county has or the unincorporated area has. And the town is actually not able to transfer the units to the county, at least so far that I'm aware.
I see. I believe what I heard you say was the RENA requirement that the unincorporated properties travels with them.
Essentially, yes. And I apologize if I misspoke earlier.
No, and so then, frankly, I'm sure, like many people here, I'm sitting here thinking, all right, well, what levers and buttons can we push and pull? This is a giant requirement, and it's very high for us. You say 589 units over an 8-year period. What is that? 70 per year. It's just very hard for me to picture. So what can we do? And so you've mentioned all of the consequences, the punishment that can happen if you don't meet these. And so far, it sounds as though all we can do is we can lay out carrots. We can lay out zoning, we can fee waivers, expedited approvals, change in these things. But we still doesn't mean that we will meet those requirements. And so my question to you is, are the penalties mitigated by any of the good faith efforts that we can make that show our intent, even if we're not still able to meet it? Because it's the property owners that are going to develop and build. We don't develop and build property. So that may be a complicated question. I hope you can answer it.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And it's probably something I should have covered at a little bit more length in the presentation. But the town is actually not required to build those units. But what the town is required to do is provide enough adequate zoning and capacity, those units are realistic. Now, if the town actually does everything in its power, it provides the amount of zoning that it's required to, and it's approved by the state, and you use realistic assumptions, but for some reason, none of the housing is built. Currently in state law, there are not penalties for that. It should be noted, though, that there have been proposals and bills that have been introduced that would introduce penalties or would introduce some other types of, they would call it mid-cycle rezoning, but those are not on the books yet. And so there's no penalty if you do not build the units. You just need to make sure that you have the capacity and that you are in compliance with the state requirements.
I see. Thank you. With that, I'll hand it to Birgitta, and then we've got Councilmember Mock.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Mayor Tyson. Yeah, I just have some questions as far as some of the technicalities here. I went through and read the whole housing element of our previous cycle here, and also spoke to Steve Padovan and a few others, and just kind of been toying around with certain ideas. One thing that I was wondering about is because we're looking for these dwelling units, and can we expand our definition of the dwelling units such that it could include room rentals of some sort? Because I'm just thinking here, we have a couple of properties besides Foothill College, which I was reading in our paperwork here, is 122 acres, and there was something like, was it 20 acres that was undeveloped at Foothill College. We also have Daughters of Charity, which is, of course, a religious organization, that they've got like 42 acres. We've got Poor Clare's Monastery. At least that would hit our like very low income areas, because they definitely don't have the incomes. But the thing is, if you have people residing in these locations, like say the two religious ones, can you somehow make their individual rooms somewhat accountable unit? Can we expand by maybe incentivizing, adding kitchen efficiencies to it? What can be done? Because also quite a few residents are in the older aging bracket and they do rent out housing, or rooms in their houses to the grad students of Stanford University, for example, or maybe to students of Foothill College. What kind of leeway, what kind of creative ways can we work with kind of using those numbers to help us out with these RHNA numbers?
That's a really good question. And there's a little bit to unpack there. So I'm going to do my best. And I also might need to come back at a later date. Since, again, this is kind of a nuanced and complicated discussion. But counting room rentals would probably not be allowed under state law. There are requirements for units. It needs to be, I guess, like a census defined unit, which, as you mentioned, has a kitchen and it has a bathroom. There are certain kind of thresholds and floor criteria for what makes a unit. Interestingly enough, many student housing units or what we would consider a unit, are actually not considered a unit under housing element law. And so that can be a challenge in towns like yours, where there is a college that might want to build housing, but maybe not every room will have its own kitchen or bathroom. There might be some leeway for us to explore that. Room rentals themselves probably would not count, but there might be some opportunity, as you mentioned, to working with different faith-based organizations active in the town to maybe add the features that would create a unit or make it eligible as a unit under state law. And that could be a strategy that the town could consider.
So, Chair Indigo, if I may, I want to add something to it. So under the HCD guidance, there is something called single resident occupancy. They're called SROs. And basically, these are the kind of units which are single room, but the caveat is that these have to be separate living quarters and occupied by persons who consider these units as their usual place of residence. So, unlike motels or hotels, these have to be their main place of residence. But there is a provision for single resident occupancy rooms. So this is something that we can look into for this purpose, and we can explore definitely.
Great.
Thank you.
Councilmember Mock then.
Excellent presentation. I'm not entirely enthused about the subject matter and what is being imposed upon us today. However, I do have some questions with respect to infrastructure. I know that in the last 5 cycles, there have been so many lots that have been redeveloped or used. And basically, it's my belief that we're running out of lots. If we're adding 500 or 600 units in the next 8 years, so who pays for the infrastructure, i.e. the PG&E extensions, the sewage extensions, the additional allocation for roads that we may need, maybe churches and schools and so forth? Are there any allocations for us in terms of monetary, I guess, contributions by the state to provide for this infrastructure that definitely will be needed?
That's another really good question, and it's pretty involved. So I'll do my best, and I might have to come back with more information at a later date. But oftentimes, the development impact fees are what funds that infrastructure over time. There are also different bonds that the city could issue. That is atypical, but it of course can fund infrastructure. And there might be some grants available as well, just depending on what the state has available, as well as, if there are any federal grants that the city could qualify for. But generally, these improvements are paid for through development impact fees or installed by the developers. Though the city does need to do its part in making sure that there is adequate infrastructure available for these new units.
Thank you.
Thank you. How about, well, let's go to Vice Mayor Swan, and then after that, we'll switch to the public. And so any public that has not raised your hand yet, so far I only see one, we'll come to you then. And then I tell you what, we'll do Commissioner Patel after Swan, Vice Mayor Swan, and then we'll go to the public.
I have a question. If you're using ADUs, quite a bit of the town is on septic. So if a house is on septic and they put in an ADU, does that mean it doesn't count?
Mayor, if I may, that unit would still count as long as it meets the requirements of an ADU. So that would be okay. The infrastructure requirements in state law and in HCD policy really apply to multifamily sites. And so it might be, again, better with an example. The intent is that the town or another town wouldn't rezone an isolated parcel far away from infrastructure and amenities and then say that can meet their low income need. That would not be sufficient. But for an ADU, if it's actually being rented at a certain income level, say it's affordable to low incomes, then that would still count towards the low income requirement.
Okay. Let's go on to Commissioner Patel.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I had a slightly different question. I'm sure that you have looked at multiple towns and cities in California, and I was curious to know what towns or cities in our state would be similarly challenged as ours in terms of creating more RHNA units, especially in the affordable housing areas.
That's a really great question. And well, let's be honest, Los Altos Hills is a little bit unique in that it really doesn't have any commercial land uses or any industrial land uses for the most part. And so I'm aware of basically 2 other cities in the state, and there may be a few more that have similar land use patterns. So one of them is actually they're both in the Los Angeles region. And one of them is called the City of Rolling Hills, which also really has kind of the large lot rural residential uses and not much else besides some schools and faith-based institutions. And then there's also the City of Bradbury, which is also in Los Angeles County, has a similar land use type. Those cities did not have anywhere near the amount of units that the town of Los Altos Hills had. And the reason for that is because those cities are a little bit further away from the middle of Los Angeles. And so they didn't have as high proximity to jobs. And so I think every city is challenged. I've worked with a city that had a 1000% increase in their RHNA. They went from 400 units to 4,000. And so everybody's challenged in meeting it, but I will say that the town of Los Altos Hills has a unique challenge given the different environmental resources and the land use constraints.
Very good. I hope that answered it. And Commissioner Couperus, I'm going to come back to you, but I did promise to the public, so I'm going to stick with that promise. And I'm going to call upon Sasha first. And after that will be Ann or John O'Connell. So if you could elevate Sasha, and we'd like to hear from you.
Yes, hi, thank you. On the notion of levers to pull, and I think there are some easy ones. Los Altos Hills is 5,777 acres with something on the order of 3,100 parcels, or about 1.86 acres per parcel. We could switch LUF for gross area and probably meet all of our requirements more or less at a stroke. Failing that, of course, we could mildly reduce the minimum lot size, maybe from 1 to 0.8 or something like that. Though I don't know how the state would allow us to project usage of those changes in zoning. Maybe a little bit more facetiously, if annexing territory also annexes its RHNA, then surely the reverse is true. I suppose we could de-incorporate territory and make it the county's problem. And then finally, I wanted to close with a question, which is, will we ask owners if they expect to redevelop before adding them to a sites inventory? For example, has the builder's remedy been legally tested? How could we expect it to be used? Thank you.
Aaron, I don't know if you feel, well, if you see a comment that you'd like to make to that.
I will leave it up to you. If you would like me to address that comment, I can do my best, though there were a few aspects of the comment. I think the one thing I will say is that there's not a single zoning change to a development standard, like a lot size or a setback, that is going to help the city meet its RHNA. So I think it's going to need to be a really nuanced discussion where we look at everything specifically.
Very good. Thank you for that answer. I'd like now to move to Ann or John O'Connell.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
I've just recently read the SB9 addendum and tried to go through and get my head around that. And to put in maybe in perspective my comment, so far I've been supportive of doing whatever we can to avoid SB9 creating a potential kind of mess. But in reading it, I start to feel as though we're really, we're acting, but we're not acting with a direction as to what we're trying to achieve. And I actually believe, as I read through that emergency ordinance, there are many, many kind of aspects of it that, frankly, as a resident, I was struggling with understanding if somebody was going to do it, was it actually sort of going to work out to be a positive? I also think, to the point that was made about us being unique, we don't have a grocery store, we don't have any center where you would normally see this kind of development that is in these documents that would occur. Palo Alto Hills won't have the same problem as Los Altos Hills because it's part of Palo Alto. Los Altos won't have the problem because it has a commercial center. Our problem is, if these state laws are going to continue, is it possible to be a city like Los Altos Hills? So I think all of this stuff of SB9, etc., we need to think about the bigger picture of what is happening. Because I'm starting to question whether or not we can continue with these kinds of challenges.
Thank you, John. With that, I think I will just take it back to our panelists, and Commissioner Couperus has been waiting most patiently, and I hand it to you, Yitzi.
You're muted.
And you're muted still. You're still muted. There we go.
Oh, there I am. Yeah, this is a question that may not have a good answer, but I wanted to raise it in case I missed something. In our experience so far with ADUs, we've run into a problem where there's a rock and a hard spot. We have to approve them administratively. We have no say in the matter. It's an ADU, you have your right. But by allowing it, we've created a situation where the fire department says, there's too many people living on that road. Instead of it having to be 12 foot wide, it now has to be 20 foot wide. And this is just an example. And there is no way we can make that road 20 foot wide, either because of physical constraints, it's cut into the edge of a hillside, or because it is going through other people's property on an easement, and it's not in the other people's interest to widen that easement. So administratively, it's been approved, but the fire department says, we're not going to say okay. And then, as far as I know, the bottom line comes down to the insurance company says, because you didn't meet the fire department standards, we won't insure it. So even though it was administratively approved, the insurance company has the final say. Can you comment on that at all?
So I may actually give that one to one of the planners from the city, if that's okay, since I'm a little bit less familiar with the specifics of ADU development in your town.
Please do. If somebody here on this call can answer that, please go ahead and unmute and tell us, Sophia, what you're thinking.
I'll defer that to Steve because he's the one who on regular basis, reviews these ADUs.
Sure. Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, commissioners and council members. Basically, we have submitted a lot of these ADU projects and the fire department has approved them with sprinklers. There hasn't been any requirement to widen the driveway beyond the 12 feet that I've seen with the building permits that have been issued. So at this point, with just an ADU and a single family home on a property, there hasn't been a requirement to widen that driveway past the 12 feet.
Okay.
Now SB 9 could change all that because now you're putting 4 units potentially on that one property.
I can weigh in slightly on this. The ADU situation, I think we have resolved. The fire department recently said that they would say that the smaller driveway is okay as long as it serves no more than 3 parcels, whereas before it used to say dwellings. However, that doesn't solve the problem for lot subdivisions that can now create this problem. So it is something that we may face in the future.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner Washura. I don't see any other questions in front of us. And so I would say, I think what I do is perhaps we're in closing. If there's any comments, say, I'm going to call upon the city manager. Do you have, I feel like this has been a very worthwhile exercise here to lay out in front of the public what we're facing and what some of the issues are. I see both the hands up from planning director Mangalam as well as the city manager. So I'll let you speak in the order that you prefer.
Go ahead, Sophia. You go first.
Okay. I just wanted to bring to your attention the public comment that we got via email. So if Mayor, I may, so that Aaron can answer that.
Oh, please do, yes.
Okay, thank you. So the question reads, must the very low-income housing be freestanding units? For example, if nannies are provided live-in housing in town residences, can that count towards the very low-income housing number requirements?
If I may, so
Please.
This goes back to a similar question about room rentals that we discussed earlier. And so if the unit meets the requirements of a dwelling unit, including that it has a kitchen and it has a bathroom, as well as a few other standards, then the answer would be yes, as long as it's a new unit that gets added. If it doesn't meet those requirements and say it's a room rental, then the answer would be no, it would not meet the qualifications for a unit.
Was that all the public comments you received by email? All right, very good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. And city manager, Peter, go ahead.
Thanks, Mayor Tyson. I wanted to first of all thank the City Council and the Planning Commission for participating. And obviously Michael Baker International, their experience, I think we're in good hands. They're going to represent us well. It's going to take some creativity to get where we need to go. A few caveats that I would offer, as presented by Aaron, this is going to be a challenging time for all of us. And I extend that not only to us, but to my other city manager friends in other places like Rolling Hills, like Hidden Hills, like other residential only communities around California. There's a lot of momentum building and a lot of us are going to be challenged with the same types of questions. And the state is not very forgiving in this round. When I first started in local government, housing elements were done in-house. they're never done in-house anymore because they're so complicated and there's so much case law and so much state and assembly bills that you have to bring in consultants. The other thing I would offer is that to no fault of anybody on this call, we're starting late. Most cities have been well underway and we are just getting started. We had to accelerate this meeting in particular because we have a series of community engagements that are facing us over the next several months that we need to get done prior to initiating an administrative draft. Aaron, that administrative draft, which is essentially a rough draft of this document, needs to be prepared by May, April?
Yeah, our goal is to really have it done at the end of April or early May at this point.
Okay, so that gives you a sense of, we need to have a draft of this document with sites and general language of the housing element in a few short months. So as the leaders of this town, we're really relying on you to help us get the word out, receive that public testimony, understand the community, get some opportunity sites so we can start doing our analysis. So I just wanted to just reassure that we're all in this together, but we do have some challenges ahead of us and some difficult conversations, to say the least. And so I just wanted to offer our complete support, and we'll get us together. We'll get there together, and hopefully we'll still be, intact. So I'll leave it back to you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Peter. And I see Commissioner Patel, you raised your hand again, so I'd like to call on you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Mayor. After hearing our city manager, I had a question regarding a little bit more details on the timelines which were shared, especially for maybe the next couple of months. What are the activities which are being planned, and where do you see us, the commission, or even the council getting engaged?
Aaron, I can take that,
Go ahead,
Mayor,
please.
if I may. Commissioner Patel, during every planning commission meeting, I will be sharing information, at least with the planning commission. Staff is also looking to have some virtual pop-up events where community members can discuss any issues or any ideas with with staff directly, so that it's less formal and they can ask the questions that they want. And this detailed timeline that you're talking about, we will be sharing it on our webpage. That's why I've been asking everyone, please, over the course of next few months, I would encourage all the community members to regularly go to that webpage. We will be updating it regularly. We'll be adding a lot of information. Just I think yesterday, I added the housing data needs packet that we got from HCD. That is the basis of our demographics information. So on a regular basis, we will be sharing this information, and definitely we will try to get the word out so that the community is aware, Planning Commission is aware of this information, and so is the City Council.
Sophia, could you provide the dates of we have, I think, how many community engagement events, and when are they?
So definitely we have 2 community workshops. They are more in a formal setting, like how we have it today in a webinar format. But staff is also looking at additional pop-up events, which I'm thinking around 2 to 4, depending on the kind of response that we get. I think we're definitely looking at least 2 pop-up events in February. That will give us some understanding about the community workshop in March, then another 2 pop-up events in April, and then community workshop again in the month of May.
Very good. Well, thank you for all that detail. And it looks like Commissioner Washura, go ahead.
Just a quick question, similar to those events. I heard there is a survey coming.
Yes.
Can you preface a little bit about when we would expect that survey to go out? How would it go out? What kind of questions we're asking residents to think about and provide feedback on? Thank you.
Definitely, thank you. So Commissioner Mashura, the survey we're going to roll out on January 31st. Okay, it's basically some of the requirements that we have from HCD in terms of the feedback that we require for community input. And I think it's also going to be related to affirmatively fair, furthering fair housing. Definitely on that context, something related to SB 9 units, questions related to ADUs, so we can get a sense of how the community would react to certain programs. So as I said, January 31st, we'll be rolling out this survey on our website. We will be initially it will be rolled out on our website, but we will also be sending out, like how we sent the postcard for this joint session. We will be sending out that survey via mail. And again, if you have any other feedback how we should get the survey questions answered, please do so. I was also thinking during our pop-up events towards the end, we will have those questions and let the community give us their feedback on those survey questions.
Great, that sounds like a plan. Let's go back to the public because I see that Sasha Zbrozek has another question. So let's go ahead and elevate him. Go ahead, Sasha.
Thank you. Yeah, I had worked up a letter with a number of recommendations for policy changes that could help us meet our RHNA that got quite a lot of support from other members of the public. And I don't think it was addressed here in this meeting, but I would love to know when to expect to see some analysis on the potential impacts on construction and how those may be banked on RHNA. Because I think they're fairly moderate proposals that would not require vast swaths of dense zoning and could make a real difference. Thank you.
Thank you, Sasha. I'm going to suggest that we'll just have our planning staff get back in terms of a response. We did receive your letter. I read it already. I saw it was signed by a number of people. It had a good half dozen or more issues on it. And so I think it'd be better to get a thoughtful written reply to you. And so with that, I do believe everybody who has expressed interest has spoken. So I want to, at this point, say, let's move to adjourn. I would like to thank the staff, the council members, the commissioners, and of course the public for participating in this event. And I wish you all a good night.
Good night.
Thank you.